welcome to Sense Space. Today I'm here with Mike Kauschke. I think I got that right. He's the editor of Evolve magazine and a friend that I encountered at the Emerge gathering last year in Berlin. And he's recently published a really beautiful book, the name of which I don't know that I'll translate correctly, so I'll allow him to introduce it. But Mike, it's really good to have you on the podcast and sort of start this conversation because there's so many things for us to explore.
Great. Thank you very much. Great to be here. And yeah, it was great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to that conversation. And the book you are talking about is not yet published. It will be published in July, but I'm working on the last little edits. And it's called in German Auf der Suche nach der verlorenen Welt, eine Reise in die poetische Dimension des Lebens, which would mean in English something like searching for the lost world, a journey into the poetic dimension of our lives. Something like that.
Beautiful. And so I think maybe we start at the end, at the present moment, with what you've sort of been hammering away at and giving form to in this book, and then maybe a little bit of sort of what's fed into that, and perhaps a little bit about how you've been drawn to emergent dialogue as well and how you've been involved in that. So what's sort of what are some of the poetic dimensions of life that you are drawing out in this work?
Yeah, I mean, this book is really also an emergent process. It has been, and it still is. It's still continuing for me, this topic. And now the book is finished. And there will be, I guess, also further books on the topic, because it really emerged for me. And it's also a topic that is part of my life since early youth. So this poetic dimension in many ways was always a part of my life, and also came out of a longing, I could say, for a deeper understanding, a deeper connection to life that led me to many things in my life, to spiritual search, to certain type of engagement in work, when I worked, for instance, in hospice care, or my latest work with dialogue and the Evolve magazine. For me, that's kind of all part of it, and it fed into this book and into the kind of emergent sense. All of this wants to be somehow further explored in the form of a book, and that's what I did, and I tried to understand my own fascination with poetry and with the poetic perception of the world. And I felt there is something in the poetic dimension of life that is much more than just a kind of type of literature or something to read, which is beautiful. But I felt that also the poets that I was always drawn to, they were poets, obviously, but they were doing it with their whole existence. So it was not a kind of a hobby or a writing method. It was kind of bringing one's own whole existence on the line, so to say, and finding through poetry ways of speaking to that, inquiring into that, what the deepest meaning of life is, or of the life is, that the poet was encountering in their own life, and in the challenges and in the deepest moments of bliss. So, and in the book, I kind of try to bring that down to certain qualities that I call qualities of a poetic art of living, which are 12 qualities that I found are inherent in the poetic dimension of life, and I'm exploring then in that book, and we can go into that if you want, but maybe there's also something else you want to know, because that will take us quite deep into it
Yeah, I mean,
already.
it's just interesting. It sounds as if the life of the poet, the life practice, the way of living is greater than the poetry itself. And the poetry is almost the attempt to pull that through, that greater experience through into words that can be shared. And then when we read the poetry, somehow we're getting a window into that larger way of seeing that the poet inhabits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think that's also for many people the fascination with poetry, that it's a very certain use of words that is different than an intellectual understanding or a kind of rational inquiry. It speaks more to a sense of imagination, of intuition, of connectedness.
Mm.
No, and I feel that's the fascination with poetry. When we read a poem that is touching us, we feel it's somehow speaks to a deep intuition in ourselves of how to be with the world.
Mm.
And poets that have a capacity to express that in words often can make that, bring that in resonance in us. You know, when you read a poem and you feel, oh wow, it opens a view of the world that is inherent in me, and I know it's there, but sometimes it needs this little spark or this kind of door opening to to get into that view, you know, and that's for me what poetry can do to open that view. And also, and that's my idea with the book, then to also see it's not only the gift of poets to be in that poetic state. It's actually much larger, and not to undermine also the particular gift that great poets have, but also to see is actually speaking to a way to be with the world that I think is of great resonance or great significance for us as human beings, to really be deep at home in the world and also caring for the world. And so for me, this also has a very much also a political dimension, you could say, or a dimension that has to do with how we actually are in the world, and also how we are in a world that has so many crises at the moment. And I feel also that the poetic way of being in the world has answers to that are of different kind than kind of rational solutions or or kind of environmental concerns. They're all good, but I think the poetic sense can also infuse all of those other activities with a certain depth and warmth and connectedness and soulfulness, to put it in a word. And that's really what kind of emerged from me also writing the book, this significance. And yeah, I'm trying to bring that out and introduce people into maybe this kind of significance of the poetic perception of life.
Yeah, I love the soulfulness. There's something about that word for me, like in the last year, has really started to take on a new life and a new meaning. I think, previously the notion of spirit was much more alive, but now soul is really coming into its own. And it's amazing when a word can really blossom in its meaning. So you've published in Evolve magazine essays by John Vervaeke, who also has sort of been looking at this problem of meaning crisis of alienation and disconnection. And it sounds like you're sort of understanding the present moment from another lens. And I'm wondering, in John's work, he's really drawing things up from the soil. He's drawing from the past. He's drawing from the ancients and the Enlightenment thinkers and so on. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the history aspect of this and how it's sort of changed your relationship to the past to go on this journey with the poetry.
You mean the past in terms of our human history or my own past?
I'm interested in both, Mike, so whichever feels
Okay.
more.
Yeah. I mean, for me, there's definitely a deep tradition that I feel connected to. I mean, in human culture, and in my book, I see it really also as a kind of a, what's the word, reference to the early romantics. This is a movement in particular in Germany that I felt, as far as I when I began to know about those movements, those poets and thinkers, felt a deep affection to, because they were at the beginning of modernity. When the kind of scientific method and the rational approach to the world was kind of getting really going, like in the beginning of the 1800s, then they said, yeah, that's great. I mean, they welcomed the movement to more individual autonomy. That people can actually, we are not just following the church and what people tell us, but there's also this creativity in oneself. We can actually, have create our lives from our own, also understand the world from our own, and inquire deeply. And those early romantics like Novalis, which is a famous German poet, and some others, and they also had a kind of a group in Jena in Germany where they met and also did dialogue. and they called it, actually it's a German word, it's Sym philosophieren. So they said they're not philosophizing on their own, they're doing with each other. It's kind of philosophizing with each other, which is very much dialogos, you could say. They were really inspiring each other, and I felt, and they were at this moment where modernity took on speed. They also said, oh, wait a moment, maybe we also need to not lose something, or also include in our way how we use our own human capacities to create and to understand the world, also the inner dimensions of imagination, of poetic sensing, of deep inquiry into also images that hold a lot of meaning. So they were saying, yeah, that this is the science. And the good thing about them, or what I find inspiring, they were really combining it. They were really philosophers. They were kind of really going into the philosophy that was emerging at that time. They were poets. They were artists. They also, thought about how a different kind of theology could look like. They were also scientists. I mean, Novalis was studying, I don't know how you call it in English. He was kind of studying how to, when you go underground into the mountain and mining, he was a kind of a specialist for mining and geography and things like that. So he was very much into that. And I could go on long about that, and also Goethe, is kind of famous for bringing in a whole different way of approaching a scientific method. He was developing a method that is not just kind of cutting things apart and then inquiring into them, but actually looking how, for instance, with the plants, he did a lot of research on how plants grow, how they actually form, how they live. So he was researching from observing, from being with what is, and really seeing how is this living, how is this unfolding, and can I sense it in myself, this unfolding? And it's a very different scientific method, and then just cutting the plant and kind of dissecting it, and this is there and this is there, and so, and I feel connected, very much connected to this whole area, you could say, of cultural inquiry that emerged there in this time, and was also taken on by others. There are many streams you could name that kind of took that further. I mean, also the romantics in other countries, or then the poets and philosophers in America, like Walt Whitman, and this whole kind of tradition, you could say, and people like Hermann Hesse in Germany, up to philosophers like Heidegger. I mean, there are all kinds of streams moving through human culture that I find interesting, and I felt always drawn to some of those in my own search, and also in the research of the book even more. And I feel that this tradition actually holds something for the future in it, and that's why I feel this. I find that historic connection very interesting, and also interesting in terms of how to respond to the challenges we are in now. Because maybe just one thing because you mentioned John Vervaeke, and what he is also trying to kind of uncover is this different ways of knowing, and he speaks of one way of knowing this as the participative knowing, where you really participate in what you know, and this is very much what for instance Goethe was doing in his research. He was a participative scientist, and I feel this really, as also John Vervaeke says, this kind of knowing that is much more embedding you into the experience of the world and its meaning, and it's really being in the world. I mean, that's a Heidegger term, but really being, going beyond or underneath the alienation that is there in our culture in many ways. I feel that has a lot of significance for our own lives, for social interaction, and for how we respond to ecological crisis, or even to something like conflicts, between people, between nations, and so I feel there's a lot of potential in there that is not fully has not really fully bloomed yet.
That's wonderful. Yeah, like the sense of all of those roots, all of those streams are coming through into the present, but there's also a future for them, insofar as you are the vessel that is drawing all of that together. And I wonder if on this journey you had a sense of often for me there's a sort of mysterious feeling of like, oh, I've been drawn to the exact philosopher or text or piece of poetry that I needed to discover in this time, and there's a feeling that it is being gathered together through me in a new way.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's what I enjoyed or enjoy also in the process of writing, because I really experience it as a deep dialogue. Many of the things that I also now was saying and I write in the book also come from our dialogues in the magazine, the Evolve magazine. and other dialogues that we do with the emergent dialogue work. And then also in the writing, I discover, like you're saying, I discover philosophers, poems, poets, and they open a door, and then in a way you enter this inner space where they are all present, and then there's a new voice coming, like, oh wow, I never heard about that, and they are speaking to something that you thought in another direction, and it emerges this dialogue of voices that are not just information, but they, in a way, I sense them more in a heart space, because because it's, I'm writing this book, but it's also, it's not new in a way. It's just, it's said by many people in different ways. And then in bringing, connecting to those people, wherever they are, in which culture or in which time, they are there, they are present. It's a very different time experience also, because they are there, and then they speak, and you sense, oh wow, this is and from that dialogue something emerges that is then how I bring it together in my voice, and kind of my little voice in the big dialogue of culture. And that's why I really enjoyed writing, to enter that kind of dialogical space.
Wonderful. And yeah, just coming up for me is that striking sense that for those philosophers, for the founding fathers of the United States and so on, when they were engaging in that work, it wasn't the past, it was the present for them. And it's quite encouraging when you can discover these polymaths and these pioneers who were able to respond to their own circumstance, their own time. Even for me recently, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin has been incredibly inspiring. Mm-hmm. And he was, a chaplain in the First World War and writing his masterwork in the middle of the Second World War. And it was so amazing for me to see, like, oh, he was able to still see and birth this poetic vision whilst everything in the world was in conflict and chaos. And so that sort of gives us courage in the present moment to find that for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, and this is a really big question, so I'm wondering about the German aspect of this and the project of bringing this deeper philosophy, this deeper poetry back into contemporary German culture, and also the sort of project of Thomas Steiniger and Elisabeth Debold that you are closely in collaboration with. Talk to me a little bit about the particular significance of this for Germany today.
Yeah, big question indeed. I mean, I think there is definitely a broken relationship to that tradition that I just named, the Romantic tradition, in Germany, and also with philosophers like Heidegger, because I mean, Heidegger directly, he had this closeness to national socialist thinking, at least for a certain amount of time, but it seemed also later this kind of anti-Semitic statements in his diaries and things like that. So he is in Germany handled with care, or how we say, handled with a lot of distance, and he's much there. For instance, in the United States, there is much more freedom in engaging with what he maybe the significance of his thinking is, like Hubert Dreyfus did and others. John Viveki also draws on him, or Ian McGilchrist, and so people that are not from Germany have a much more freer relationship to dive into that, and Thomas Steininger also, it contributed a lot to my understanding of particular Heidegger. And And it's true. I mean, for any German, I think this needs to be in the picture. And I also try to do it in my own writing, not so much in this book, but in the next book that is already forming. But to also understand that how you say that there's also a shadow, like to everything there's also a shadow to this poetic dimension. It can be used heavily, and it was heavily used by the Nazis in Germany. They drawn on that romantic tradition to connect the people to the land. I mean, they used this kind of emphatic language of Hölderlin, for instance, and his kind of poetry about German cities, or also kind of his going back to the Greeks, and this kind of very emphatic language. And they used that to kind of for their ideology, and also kind of undermine the Christian tradition by saying, yeah, we're going back to the roots and all those kind of things. So, and with the Romantics, they used that heavily too. And there is also a way how you can manipulate people through this deep connection. And for me, it was really a very deep experience when I read a book by a German author. Her name is Ulla Berkowitsch. He wrote a book, Engels in Schwarzenvice, is it called? And it's actually telling the story of two young friends who were kind of through this love for poetry and a kind of meaning crisis that they were in their time, drawn into the Nazi ideology. That they felt, oh wow, this is really giving back meaning. It's kind of bringing back greatness, bringing back the heart, the soul, Wagner music, and it was, and she is writing it in a very interesting way, very poetic way, and she was also criticized for that, how she is doing that. But for me, it was really, I saw, oh, I could be that one. It could happen to me. and that was it was painful, and I could see, oh wow, it's really, so also this poetic dimension needs to be handled very how you say that, considerate, and kind of brought together with a rational understanding, a moral understanding, an ethical understanding. So I think that's really important, and I think that needs to be in the picture in this. But I think also it is a wound in Germany in a certain way to be cut off from this tradition also, because Germany, because it was used by the Nazis, it was also a bit dangerous to talk about those things in Germany. Not dangerous, but kind of maybe better not go there. And there have been people who were kind of pushing against that, and also people like Joseph Beuys, for instance, who was a famous artist, but he also had quite a poetic sense of changing the world through our creative capacities and our imaginary capacities and things like that. But I think generally in Germany there is still a kind of sense. It's this is also dangerous territory to bring, for instance, a poetic sense of the world and of life back into maybe something like politics and things like that. So that would be a conversation on its own, a long one. But I think it's something to re-engage with, because it's also a cultural treasure that I think in a certain way give this kind of misuse by the Nazis too much power, kind of from now let it be kind of consumed by that, and to be aware of that, but also look what they had to say, also what someone like Heidegger had to say, because I think there's a lot in there too, and to find a way to connect to these traditions in a way that is also aware of the dangers.
Yeah, it strikes me that holding of the shadow of these past movements and ideas, also beyond Germany, really for any modern culture who's looking to draw on the roots, whether it's Christianity, Catholicism, for the Chinese and their own lineage and so on. Each of us have to somehow navigate that integration of, moving from the place of, well, that went wrong, that went bad, reject all of it, to, okay, what was good in it, and what were the tensions, and can we sort of hold all of that? And for me, I definitely sense there is this like misunderstanding still between Germany and the world, and something about this, there's something quite wordless about what that sort of thing is. Like, it's very hard to bring to words what that disconnect is. But it's been really interesting for me as a as an outsider, as a person who grew up in England, to go on my own journey with Germany, sort of starting in Berlin and then visiting other parts, and to really rediscover this this folk culture, in the beautiful sense of it, in the architecture, in the villages, and to sort of dwell in that. And for me, it feels like there's just something about that past that I'm really drawn to understanding more deeply. And I walk around the cemeteries here and I look at the gravestones of the soldiers from the First World War, and I see the soldiers from the Second World War, and these are the Nazis, these are the bad guys of history, but they're also people, and like looking into their faces and like getting a sense for like, who were these people. And very often you see that it was the fathers had died in the First World War, and the sons then went to the Second. And so there is this real important connection between what happened in that sort of turning point of the modern age of the First World War and everything that followed. But you of course grew up long after all of these events, in a certain sense, in the opening of a new Germany. You talked about in your biography that the fall of the Berlin Wall was kind of a critical moment in your life. I'd be interested, and sort of what your experience has been of German history as a lived experience.
Yeah, that's also a big topic.
Question. So thank you for.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I grew up in East Germany, and so that's a whole chapter. But our view of history is always also shaped, by the culture we are in, and in East Germany, there was told a whole different history of Germany, in many ways. It was a socialist history. It has its own, it focused on its own ideological points that were of importance, that just, the tradition that was kind of upheld there with Karl Marx and all of that, that's how.
Wow.
It was its own. It was also its own writing of history, and also of recent history. It was also a myth that you could say, a mythic understanding, a narrative that East Germany was built on. That the Nazi Germany is now, the kind of that East Germany is the good Germany, so to say. It is the anti-fascist Germany, and kind of West Germany is kind of carrying forth the tradition of fascism in a kind of milder version, but it can break out at any time, and that's why we need to save us or protect us and build a wall, for instance, and be very, very protective and militarized and all of this kind of things. And I mean, I kind of, because I had, to me, what I learned in school about the vision of socialism and communism, it spoke to a kind of idealistic heart in myself. I felt this sounds good to me. It sounds promising to have a society where there's more equality, more, not so much power relationship, but that the people own everything and can thrive. I mean, that's basically the idea in a certain way. I mean, and when I was like 15, or maybe I started to see, oh, wait a moment, it's not really fitting. the reality that I was encountering and those ideals, they were not working. They were not fitting. It was not lived in the culture. So that made me think, and and at the same time, there was also this deeper longing, because it was also a very rationalist culture. It was a kind of materialistic rationalism that was kind of taught, that said, everything, religion is what's the word, opium. I don't know what the English word is kind of
opium for the masses.
Yeah, opium for the masses. And also inner life. Also, it was a collective culture. Your own inner, longings to bring something into the world, to unfold, was not met at all. It was kind of a very kind of collective atmosphere. Be part of the collective, a good citizen, a good worker, a good hero of socialism, kind of like that. And for me, that and at this time in my youth, I discovered the poetic kind of poetry, and I became frustrated and resignated with the culture I was in. This kind of coldness that I felt, and not really connecting to a deeper sense of being connected to life. And I found that in nature. I was very much a lot of nature, and in poetry, and also in music. I became part of this whole Gothic scene that was also in Germany. In East Germany, there was a kind of a subculture of people, punk and Gothic, and meeting each other. And there were kind of small bands that were touring, and it was always all kind of under the radar of the Stasi, or more or less under the radar. But there was a scene like that, and I felt at home there, because I felt there was this kind of longing to envision a different world, to speak more to inner longings and things like that. So that was my own kind of atmosphere that I was in when the wall came down, and then this whole thing opened up, and it was a big promise then, and a big possibility space, and I'm grateful for that also, that I had this possibility space then in my life. And also through my life, my own history with this upbringing, and with the conditioning of East Germany, which is also a certain conditioning, and kind of installs certain patterns in yourself. And that has been also a constant path of inquiry into that, and liberation and healing also. And for me, poetry was always kind of helping me also to see those patterns, or also for healing, and for instance, for me, a kind of healing moment also in the research of the book was when I dived a bit into this East German singer and poet, Gerhard Gundermann is his name. There has been a movie about him, and he was a very felt very much connected to his life question, because he was also in East Germany in touch with this vision of socialism and wanted to be there for that and believed in it, but he wanted to also infuse it with poetry and with this depth dimension, and kind of really also bumped against the authorities. But he didn't want it to just escape like others have done, but he wanted to still believe, to be able to change it from the inside, and he has a deep poetic heart, and this kind of discoveries, they are kind of also, I feel like I integrating that, and also the German history for me also, when the wall came down, and also through spiritual work, I discovered also my own the shadow aspect of German culture or history in myself in a deeper way. Also Nazi times, and what is there in the German soul, and for me also poetry helped me a lot with that. I had a phase where I was reading a lot of Jewish poets. There are many German-speaking Jewish poets that are amazing. You know, Paul Celan, for instance. I read him for a long time daily, and this was really also a healing for me to find this resonance in the depth of the soul and the heart, beyond or beneath all this violence and pain, you know. And still, like I said, maybe I could have been someone that was, how you say, seduced into that that thinking at that time. But still, now being here and being German, I felt, reading Celan, for instance, I felt just also facing. I mean, he found words, I think, also for the horror of the Holocaust in a way that's just beyond words. It just brings you brought me into this space of just facing the horror without needing to do anything or to find a solution, but just say, "Oh, this happened." And I felt that that's also a quality of poetry, to just be able to speak the unspeakable and stay with it, and also listen in a way from a place that is just deeper than any kind of mental listening in a way, and through that, being with what has been and what is, that I feel also generates a certain healing quality. And then, yeah, I also went to Israel a few times, and so that was also part of my healing, and still is, you know. And it's still alive for me. And also in writing this book, this came also alive, and I feel also there is a big significance of the poetic dimension of life for this kind of healing in many ways. I mean, this is happening in many ways with colonialism, with, you know, the treatment of indigenous cultures all over the world. I mean, I think for this healing, there is so much need at the moment also. So I think there also this poetic dimension can also support.
Wow. Mike, I'm really grateful for you to sharing that historical journey, even just a small amount of it, because it was so rich and so alien to me, like the possibility of growing up in a communist education system, and this personal and collective process of coming into a deeper relationship with the past that you sort of have embodied. And I think there's something really wonderful about, you sharing your process with it, and other people sharing their process with it can somehow inspire and give companionship to others who are going through their own unique journey with it. And I really recognize the courage and truth of like seeing oneself in the villain, in the bad guy. And it's something that in my own journey I felt, as you speak to far beyond Germany, there's so many instances of darkness and cruelty in human history that I think it's some ways a rite of passage or an initiation for all of us to reach that place where we can sit into what has occurred without needing to change it, just to be with it. And that's a rapturous, soul-rending sort of thing to go through, but also a real profoundly healing and opening place to go as well. So I think we are just closing up on today's conversation. We're doing a shorter one today, but I hope we will speak again. And really grateful to you for coming on to Sense Space today, Mike. Any closing words for this conversation or for people listening? Please.
Yeah, just thank you very much for this conversation, and I'm really happy to continue this, and feels always also a gift. I mean, that's the gift of dialogue. Feel also being, speaking with each other like we just did about this deeper journey into the soul or the ensoulment of each other, of our lives, and of the world. And for me, that's really also the essence of a poetic way of being in the world. And I definitely hope we can continue this conversation. I really enjoyed it. Also the way you kind of brought things out that I had not thought about for a while. And it's always interesting to hear oneself say those things.
Thank you, Mike. And I'm always drawn to interesting and weird things, but going towards those things always brings out something really alive. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.